Welcome back, folks. It's the Fantasy Slant powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings.com. This is the special IDP edition of the Fantasy Slant, and I'm your host, Jeff Ratcliffe. Back for Week 8. That is really almost the halfway point. You know, you're not playing in Week 17. You don't do that, do you? We're at the halfway point, close to, and that means we're also getting ever closer to the fantasy playoffs, probably week 13 for a lot of your leagues. So things are starting to get clearly defined. But we always have to be looking forward, looking back, and assessing everything all at the same time. And by we, of course, I mean myself and the great Ross Miles. Ross, what's going on, man?
The Rams won last week. Dude, can you believe it? In the podcast, we both said there's no chance this is going to happen. You made a joke about it. I said we were about to get our asses whooped by an angry Seahawks team, and that is not what happened at all. I thoroughly enjoyed that game. I'm sure everyone's seen the punt returns. It's not IDP related, but damn, that was fun. That was fun. It's good to see a team win a game. I don't know this feeling. Since I've been a Rams fan, we've won like 1 in 3, 1 in 4, so every win feels so good, so good. And I work with a Seahawks fan, so the fact I actually get to mock a Seahawks fan to his face in the office, brilliant.
Well, and you know, I'm an IDP guy, but I'm also a team defense guy. And hey, you get some special teams points with that awesome special teams play. You have to love that. Got to give a little love to the special teams guys because they are really, in a lot of cases, the straw that stirs the drink, especially in that win last week. Just an awesome game. A really surprising game from a football standpoint, from a fantasy standpoint. I mean, we're seeing certainly Russell Wilson, the emergence of Doug Baldwin, maybe this week the emergence of Jermaine Kearse, possibly.
Paul Richardson, Jeff, come on.
Paul Richardson, a water bug-like player that both I believe you and I know I certainly did, but I believe you also liked him in our preseason evaluation. Which, by the way, we're going to expand this year. We're already kind of getting excited. I know we're getting way ahead of ourselves, though, Ross. So let's look back to last night. One of the benefits now to doing this show on a Friday is we do have a game behind us, and arguably the most anticipated Thursday night game of the entire season. San Diego, a team that really has performed well this year, has a quarterback who is playing really some of the best football out there, and certainly the best football of Philip Rivers' career against those mighty Denver Broncos in Denver, which is, Ross, you were in Denver last year. You got to see what this is like in first person. You know exactly the experience there. It's a home field advantage, no doubt about it. And, of course, we saw the Broncos really kind of run away with this one, although some defensive performances almost made this one close. And Ross, the player that probably stood out the most to me, and I think probably likely to you as well, and very likely to a lot of the viewers of the game last night, was Eric Weddle. Really just an awesome game across the board. He was all over the place. Anywhere the ball carrier was, it seems like Weddle was either tackling him or he was about to tackle him. Somebody else got to it first, but he was there. He's making plays. He's forcing fumbles. He's that interception, what was that, called back. He was all over the place last night. So just a general thought of Weddle, because this is a guy certainly whose numbers weren't where we had hoped they would be maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. But do you think that this is really the true Weddle? This is a Pro Bowl player, and this is an elite defensive back.
I do, and I'm massively, massively biased to Eric Weddle. He's arguably my favorite player. Obviously, being a Utah Ute myself, you may have noticed that I don't have the Weddle jersey behind me. That's been replaced by the Isaac Bruce, but the Weddle jersey now sits above my desk at work, alongside my Weddle framed card and all my other Weddle memorabilia. So trust me, I'm a big Eric Weddle fan, and making those kind of crazy interceptions isn't like a rarity for Weddle. You know, he made 7 a couple of years ago. I've seen some other great picks against the Colts if you go back and watch some games. It's just, I think if you probably don't know me too well on other social channels, but I think my nickname on many social channels is Weddle Watch, because when I watch a game of Eric Weddle in, that's all I'm doing. I'm just watching the man, the legend. I do feel a little bit sorry for him the other day. Was it on 4th down, like 4th and 25? He did try and pass it on a punt, and it went horribly. But that's the kind of playmaker Weddle can be. He actually has that kind of dynamism in his game. He was definitely exciting at Utah, and I'd have loved him all the way in the pros.
Yeah, possibly one of the coolest beards out there. So you have to love that. You have to love the play. He was really the lone bright spot, excelling in pass coverage last night, and like I said, sort of all over the field. Really wasn't good elsewhere. Corey Liuget, I guess, was okay. You'll take sort of what you got out of him, but you were hoping maybe he could possibly get to Manning. That just didn't happen last night. As a whole, our staff recorded 4 quarterback pressures for the entire Chargers team. Now, if we flip over to the Broncos, Derek Wolfe had 4 quarterback pressures. Okay, Derek Wolfe, this guy doesn't pressure the quarterback, and he had 4 on his own. Von Miller also had 4. So that's really, just to show you kind of the performance you got here. But for an IDP standpoint, okay, Donald Butler wasn't exactly what you'd hoped either. Remember, tackle stingy venue, and Butler still going to be in that LB3 range, even with the injuries that we're going to get to in a moment. But Ross, a player I want to bring up, and by the way, too, Jason Verrett, banged up coming into the game, probably should have sat out. And it sounds like he may have re-injured that shoulder, and this could possibly be worse. A guy who I talked about 2 weeks ago who I was really excited about now could miss some extended time. But there's an opportunity here, and a player who stood out to me last night, not for his play, well, I mean, maybe a little bit, but Sharice Wright. And we know, Ross, that this is a guy, when he's on the field, he's going to get picked on because he's not one of the best cover corners out there, although he had 2 passes defense last night. But in the same right, because he gets picked on, he has a lot of opportunities for tackles, and he's putting up a lot of tackles. Now, last night, 4 solos, okay? You'll take it because he had those 2 passes defense. But I just kind of want to see your thoughts on Sharice Wright. I know you like to play in leagues that divide safety and corner up into separate positions. So do you see this guy as somebody who could potentially be a CB1, or is he still more of a streamer to you?
I don't know if I'd quite go as far as CB1, Jeff, but he's someone who's definitely going to be on my radar as long as the Chargers are struggling at cornerback. I mean, Wright was a guy who the Broncos have picked on before. I think he allowed 3 touchdowns to Demaryius Thomas in 1 game last year. And if you're a follower of the In the Trenches article, this week's article was all about targets and cornerbacks. And if you have a quick look at the coverage data from last night, Jeff, you'll see that Sharice Wright saw 13 targets, 10 of them when covering Demaryius Thomas. And by crunching some numbers, I did identify that cornerback targets is in fact a slightly stronger metric for fantasy potential than total tackles recorded by linebackers. Now we all know that linebackers and high tackles means plenty of fantasy points. So knowing that targets is for cornerbacks is an even better metric. I think Sharice Wright is a guy you're probably going to want to identify and pick up in your league if he's available, assuming he's got Flowers or Verrett opposite him. If it is Richard Marshall, I don't know, Marshall's equally dodgy, so they could see a little bit of a bigger sharing of targets. But last night they obviously put Demaryius, Wright saw plenty of Thomas, and that's why he saw those targets.
Yeah, it was interesting too, because we did see Marshall eventually get on the field there, obviously with Verrett going out, and he wasn't picked on as much as I thought he was going to be. Now, he was picked on for a touchdown pass, one of the 3, the long one, to Emmanuel Sanders, but Wright's going to have some opportunities. He's a sneaky player in the right matchups. And what's interesting as well is he's had some tackle production in games this season where he hasn't been targeted, which tells me that he's getting a little bit involved. I haven't watched him very closely in some of these games, but he's getting involved perhaps in run support a little bit, maybe crashing a line. Obviously couldn't do that last night covering Demaryius for most of the game, but keep an eye on him. Now let's switch over to the Denver side, and made a few references to this already, but the first thing I have to say is I was watching that game and sort of on and off taking a little bit of notes, but was very intently watching when Von Miller put a first step on DJ Fluker that basically you see Fluker is like whoa, and then boom, he's gone, and then there's a sack. That first step from Von Miller on that sack is unbelievable. DJ Fluker he's not a bad player. He's a pretty good player. This has been a pretty good offensive line that doesn't yield a lot of sacks. And boom, Miller just right by him. So Miller's playing at an elite level. Now, he's not racking up a ton of tackles, but you still have to like the sack upside from a fantasy standpoint, especially if you're in a balanced scoring league. Really love him if you're in one of those big play scoring leagues. But Ross, the few things that we need to really pull out here, the linebacker position obviously is a spot where everybody is keeping a close eye. And what we expected, Brandon Marshall playing every down, that happened. He put up his share of tackles. Okay, you're happy if you started him. But Ross, the player that stands out here, Nate Irving, was actually out there for 50 snaps, 50 out of the 62. Now, I haven't taken a close look yet. I don't really do my analysis until Mondays at the actual breakdown of sub-package snaps, but that would indicate to me that this guy was probably out there in some of the sub-package snaps. So given that Irving had that sort of role, what do you envision for this guy going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of keeping an eye on Irving, and I do like him as an option. Obviously, Marshall's the number one guy if you're looking for a linebacker in Denver. But, looking at the stats, Jeff, you can see that Bradley Roby also had 55 snaps, as well as Harris had 62. And who's the other corner there? And Aqib Talib had 58. So it definitely looks like the Chargers ran three wide quite a lot. So Irving's got 50 snaps. He definitely got used in some of those positions. I think I'd count him as kind of an upside LB3 for the time being, because I'd like to see him on the field a little bit more. Perhaps there's going to be games and matchups when they don't use so many packages that keep him on the field. So that would concern me a little bit if I wanted to elevate him too high. But talking about defensive linemen and their moves, the fake spin last week, not this week, but the week before, by DeMarcus Ware against the 49ers. Now that definitely caught my eye. Have you seen that one?
Yeah, that's certainly a move you don't see very frequently. And most players can't get away with something like that. But DeMarcus Ware actually maybe not his best game as a Bronco last night, but you're not going away from him at all. But I guess the more important thing here with Irving is that, the week before we see Marshall every down, Irving only playing 23 snaps, and Corey Nelson getting out there and playing some snaps. Now, we didn't see any of Nelson really. We didn't see him other than probably special teams. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention to special teams guys, but he wasn't in on any defensive snaps last night. So that's good. If you happen to be somebody who was holding on to Irving, you'll take it, right? And, this year with linebacker as beat up as it is, you could certainly be doing a whole lot worse. One other player before we move into the big news of the week is T.J. Ward, Ross. Now, we were talking a little bit before the show, and I know you have a sort of hard take on Ward here. So, based off of last night, what's your thoughts on T.J. Ward?
Yeah, I'm dropping dead out of the DB1 tier now, Jeff. I mean, I kind of said in the matchups over the last couple of weeks that I'm looking at Ward. I'm looking at Church and trying to really work out where I want to put them, like the return of Rashard Jones, the rise of Michael Griffin, Cyprian's getting back into form, Berry's coming back. There's plenty of guys I think are playing well, and Ward just isn't putting up statistics. I'm not saying he's playing badly. He's got a role on that Denver defense. He's perhaps staying a bit deeper than we would have liked. But at the end of the day, if he's not putting up tackle production like we hoped he would do, I don't think you can continue just insta-starting him, and I think there's probably going to be better options out there, especially in shallower leagues.
I can't say that this is a shock, because this is a defense that we've seen in the past. We really just don't see a ton of tackle production. I mean, remember the Mike Adams days. Okay, yeah, Mike Adams has one big game, and then he disappears for 5 weeks, right? That's really what we're seeing here. A lot of these tackles just aren't getting through, especially with Marshall on the field last night sort of vacuuming up tackles, Irving doing a little bit of the same, and Von Miller is a good tackler in his own right against the run. So a lot of these things a lot of these plays aren't getting through. Whereas last year, okay, he's in a situation where he's behind really DeQuell Jackson, and that's pretty much it. So there was a lot more opportunities, and the numbers came. Yeah, so it's not really necessarily a knock on Ward as a whole, but his fantasy stock has certainly taken a hit. You got to drop this guy into the DB2 range. Now, for the big news. We're burying the lead, I know, but in this season of the injury, 2014 will be known as the season of the injury. It's just every player you could possibly think of, every fantasy owner has been affected. And if you had Paul Posluszny, you were scooting by and you're like, all right, I'm good. I still have an LB1. Well, Not anymore, because of course he joins that long list of players to be sidelined. He's gone for the season with a torn pectoral. And the big question is ultimately who will replace Puzzlesny. Now, the Jags, Gus Bradley, the head coach, came out and said that JT Thomas is going to get the middle linebacker job. But the question ultimately is Thomas going to be the ever down guy, or is it going to be Geno Hayes? And I personally have been leaning more towards Geno Hayes because he's the more experienced of the two. Now, Hayes is no Paul Puzzlesny. He's not going to be an insta LB1 like a Brandon Marshall situation where, boom, this guy, okay, now he's an LB1 replacing Trevathan. I don't think we see that with Hayes. But I do think we get some value there in a situation where this team is likely to be on defense a lot. Ross, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this situation. I know it's still a head-scratcher, and it's very much in flux, but any thoughts on the linebacker situation in Jacksonville?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if it has an effect on rookie Telvin Smith, who had a pretty big game last week. I know some of the PFF graders were pretty high on him. I mean, I'm just looking at his grade for last week now, plus 5.6 overall, his first green positive grade of the season. In fact, after my waiver wire article, I had a few people get in touch with me. I was like, "Where was Telvin Smith in your article, dude? He killed it last week." And the answer is he hasn't been on the field enough until now. 40 of 77 snaps last week, a big game. You know, perhaps with Puzzlesny going down, it's not like the Jags are going to win the division. They're not a playoff team. Perhaps they kick the tires on this guy. It's a guy who we were both relatively high on as far as IDP linebackers, rookie linebackers were going. So maybe there's some value there. I'm not saying dive in and grab him now. I do want to see how it shakes out. Like you said, Jeff, you didn't even mention him as a possible for an every down linebacker or picking up some snap duties. So perhaps he's a bit further down the pecking order than some people out there think. It's very easy to get sucked into those rookie prospects and give them a higher value than they actually have.
You know, it's also easy to look at last week's fantasy point total and draw some far-reaching conclusions until we put things into perspective. He had 4 tackles, okay? Remember, interceptions, sacks, forced fumbles are going to come and they're going to go, and you can't really predict them. But you can, and Ross, you've done work on this as well, you can predict tackles. He had 4 tackles, okay? He wasn't every down. He was only out there in the sub-packages, and that's the only role we've seen him in so far this season. So I'm not willing to go that far. I mean, yeah, last week, a sack. He had, a forced fumble. He had an interception. He had 2 passes defense. So, yeah, he played great. But he's not out there in an every down role, and I don't see that shifting. That was the big concern. And Ross, if you remember, one of the things we talked about in the preseason was we'd be really excited about this guy if he's a safety, because he's really he's like built like Cam Chancellor or something like that. He's sort of a tweener and really suited well to that nickel linebacker role, but really not necessarily the strongest in the base defense. So I don't see it happening. I could be wrong. I would love to see it happen as somebody who owns him in about 6 dynasty leagues, but it's a similar situation to like what we saw with Christian Kirksey. Christian Kirksey put up good numbers last week as well, but he's not a full-time guy either. So you're going to want to keep an eye on these players, but you don't want to run out and grab them if there are viable 3-down linebackers available in your league. And if you don't know who's playing 3 downs, I have you covered every single week. You can take a look at my 3-down linebacker column every week, giving you the updated chart and some thoughts, some notes, and reactions to the changes we see each week. Ross, Vontaze Burfict does not know how to tackle. So he's tackling like somebody who never played football before, and he's banged up his neck. And maybe this is part of the reason why he's had these concussion issues this season. Looked like he suffered another one last week, but it turns out he didn't. Practiced in full on Thursday, and Emmanuel Lamore practiced in full on Thursday. So they're both going to be back in action this week. That means Vinny Ray, awesome performance last week, but he's going to be back to a 2-down role with Ray Malaluga likely sidelined. I think we should pause for a moment, though, because, Ross, I mean, if you're a Vontaze Burfict owner, obviously we know the ceiling, but we've seen the floor, and the floor is a goose egg, potentially. I mean, if the guy goes out and makes a mistake very early on, he's out for the rest of the game. So what do you do if you're in that position? Because you almost can't drop him, but can you start him? Do you feel comfortable starting him, especially in this matchup? This matchup is an awesome matchup against Baltimore, a team that's been very friendly to linebackers so far this season.
The answer is Jeff. I own Perfect in a lot of leagues, and I benched him. I actually went into my lineup last night because I Brandon Marshall in plenty of leagues as well. He is the kind of value guy you could get in waivers early on, and I put Marshall in the team over Perfect. Admittedly, there's often two or three other linebacker spots, so I can quickly sub Perfect back in. But I've dropped him right down towards the bottom of my LB1 tier. Part of me wants to be bolder and drop him further, but the risk is he is a really good player when he stays on the field for every snap. The thing is, he's only finished one game this season. If you're a perfect owner in Dynasty, you can quiet down right now because you probably got him undrafted because he was undrafted. So don't, admittedly we've seen some LB1 value out of him, but this is a guy you almost certainly got off the waiver wire in Dynasty League. So I don't think you can have too many regrets. You've got some very good points out of him in the last 1.5 seasons. If you've got him in a redraft league, you've probably had to draft him pretty high. He was a consensus top 5 back. A top 5 linebacker, top 3 for us, I think, both, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think you've got to ride it with the punches. We always tell you to relax and wait for your IDPs. If you've listened to our advice, you should have a pretty stacked bench. There's plenty of linebackers we've been pimping over the last few weeks. The C.O. Moores, your Jelani Jenkins, your Marshalls, your Durants, your Orlando McLean. So if you're listening, you've got a decent bench, and I think you should rely on that decent bench. I definitely am going to bench Perfect. I'm pretty certain in nearly every league this week. I just want to see him play a full game. I believe in my bench. I'm going to let those guys score the points, and I'll reassess it next week. Emmanuel Lemur is one of the guys I could probably play over Perfect.
Wow. See, I'm going to go in an opposite direction because if you look at his schedule, the next week he gets Jacksonville, which is a really bad matchup for tackles for linebackers. And this matchup against the Ravens is the second best for tackles so far this season. Only the Colts yield more tackles per game to linebackers. I'm a gambling man at times, and in this case, I can't see unless I have, like a situation where Marshall. I can't fault you for starting Marshall over him, but I can't start Justin Duran against Washington over Vontaze Perfect. I just have a hard time. So, it's one of those situations, Ross, you said it perfectly. Wait. Don't draft. You don't have to be the first, second, or third guy to get a linebacker in your draft. Be the 10th guy.
If you did, Jeff, you probably got Sean Lee or Kiko Alonso or Darrell Washington, so you're probably not in a good place right now.
Yeah, if it happened before the news broke, absolutely. You don't have to be that guy, and you can still stockpile tons of depth and of course work the wire as well. But if you're in that situation where you have Perfect, I feel like you almost have to start him in this particular matchup. So that's tough. Now, another tough situation, you could add Gerard Mayo, and now you don't have him. Of course, last week we saw a good game out of both Jamie Collins and Dante Hightower. Both of them put up 13 total tackles. Of course, Hightower had the better game. We talked about this on the show last week, and it looked like Hightower might be the guy of the two to like until news breaks. First news breaks that Akeem Ayers, the Patriots trade for Akeem Ayers, that comes across, and I'm thinking, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Why do they want this guy? He's barely even playing for the Titans. And then, 2-3 hours later, boom, the big news. Chandler Jones likely to miss the next month, which is devastating for this Patriots defense, and it probably hurts your fantasy team as well at a position that is extremely thin. It hasn't been hit as much by injuries as linebacker has, but defensive end especially, it's very thin this year. So he's out of the mix. I don't think we see much of Ayers at least this week, but Ayers could get worked in a little bit more. But Ross, what this tells me, what we're likely to see is Hightower is going to move outside. We saw him play outside earlier this year as well. With him playing outside, that is going to crush his fantasy value. And it means that, as I've said sort of from day one, Jamie Collins is going to be the guy who we want out of this group. The Patriots have shown some confidence in Deontay Skinner, so he's going to be out there. I don't think he'll play every down, though, so he's not somebody on our fantasy radar. But Chandler Jones, this injury really kind of it hurts Hightower, and it opens things up for Collins. But I don't know if you had any different interpretation. Are you reading the tea leaves pretty much the same as I am?
Pretty much the same as you, Jeff. Jamie Collins is the pony I'm riding there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tough situation all around. By the way, if you're in the team defense league, then you're dropping down those Patriots because that's just tough losing your best pass rusher. Rob Ninkovich he's not a pass rusher. You know, look at his sack stats over the years, and he's not hitting double digits. And Chandler Jones does double digits pretty easily. Let's see, a couple other things. Bobby Wagner sidelined last week, going to be sidelined again this week. So we'll see Malcolm Smith and KJ Wright every down. I still think KJ Wright's the guy you want here. Malcolm Smith had the better numbers last week, but I still would prefer KJ Wright. Ross, agree or disagree?
No, I agree. I'm definitely a fan of KJ Wright. I expected a bit more from him after the first few seasons in the league. Hasn't quite lived up to that promise, but then again, on that defense, when you've got Wagner, you've got Chancellor, you've got Earl Thomas who plays lights out football, it's difficult to maybe for so many good players to get fantasy points.
Yeah, absolutely. John Beeson hurt yet again. Go figure.
Yeah.
And this one, I really, if you didn't toss him back already, you just toss him back. This one's going to open the door up for Jameel McClain in a season where, hey, linebackers are scarce. You need some help. Grab Jameel McClain if he's still available before somebody else figures this out. He will play every down with Jaquan Williams, and I actually would prefer McClain over Williams. I think McClain's tackle floor is much higher. We've seen it out of him in the past. He's not going to, set the world on fire, but LB3 numbers is all you're really hoping for now. Stay afloat with your linebackers, and you're going to beat your competition who's not doing that. Another big news item here, one other one that I have on my list, Ross, deals with Morgan Burnett. Morgan Burnett we saw leave the game last week in the fourth quarter against Carolina, dealing with a calf injury and has yet to practice. Now, I didn't see the Friday practice reports just yet, but he didn't practice on Wednesday or Thursday. That's not good at all. But what is good is that Clinton Dix got his first start of the season and led the team in tackles. So Clinton Dix is an automatic pickup no matter what, but could be in an even better situation if Burnett is unable to go. Ross, just a quick, we've been paying attention to Clinton Dix since the preseason, since the draft process. So what are your thoughts on this guy, especially with his performance last week?
I'm going to say, Jeff, I'm really bitter. I am genuinely bitter because I spent some time watching more tape than I usually do in the off-season, and was a guy that was jumped off the page to me. I loved him. I wanted the Rams to draft him. But my worry was that he was going to play much more of a role along the lines of an Ed Reed or a Jarius Byrd, be more of a deep centre fielder and not get fantasy points. So I went with my fantasy head rather than my fan heart. And now look at him. I drafted Pryor in several leagues, and I should have drafted and it hurts me, man, because I love him. I think he's a great little player.
Yeah, I was really in the same boat. I think that was the consensus here. And the unfortunate thing is when we make these sorts of calls, we're often making them sort of sight unseen. In other words, these guys aren't on a team yet, and we're trying to evaluate them, and we say, okay, he projects to this kind of role. He's going to be this sort of fantasy profile, and it turned out that we were a little off on this guy. So, hey, if you grabbed him, you have to like that, and just doing some, some reconnaissance here. It says that the Packers have actually said that Morgan Burnett is making progress, quote unquote, from Mike McCarthy. I don't like the sounds of that. It sounds like he's questionable. The worst part about this scenario, Ross, is this is a Sunday night game, okay? So if you're a Burnett owner and you don't have, if you don't have Clinton Dix, if you don't have Vaccaro, if you don't have Raphael Bush, you're really in a tough situation here, and you may want to just err towards the side of caution and just avoid the situation altogether and start a safety who's maybe playing on Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, and possibly just get your points on the board and just steer clear of it. Ross, any other injury issues that I didn't cover here?
Yeah, I've got a couple. So Kyle Fuller is on track to play. He's come out and said he's going to play. I think the Bears have agreed with that. So despite the hip pointer and the broken hand, he is going to play in Week 8. And a couple of linebackers. I know we've been touching on linebackers. One is Ryan Shazier, the high-profile rookie that we were all very excited about with his sideline-to-sideline speed. He is extremely close to returning, to quote Mike Tomlin, I believe. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Potentially he'll be back on the field this week, maybe not in an every down role, though. But what I'm gonna throw to you, Jeff, because you're probably got a better finger on the pulse being in Philly, Michael Kendricks. We've got so many of these linebacker injuries, Jeff. Is he going to be an LB1 this week, and is he going to play?
I don't know if he's going to be an LB1 because of the matchup and because of the location. Playing in Arizona, it's a tackle stingy venue, one of the more stingy in the league, or most. Is it
Stingiest.
Stingiest. It just sounds weird, doesn't it? One of the stingiest tackle venues in the league. Denver being the most, the stingiest. But regardless, I don't like that. I don't like the matchup against an Arizona team that doesn't surrender a lot of tackles to our tackle-producing linebackers. But he has a full practice today on Friday, so you have to like that. All signs are pointing to Kendricks getting back on the field. So if you own him, you're very happy about that. And you're going to start him. I think he's an LB2. I have no problem with that. I just don't know if there's going to be enough opportunities to get him into that LB1 range. But still, again, you're staying afloat with a guy like Kendricks where your opponents may not have that asset, and you get an edge on him in that regard. So I'm certainly sticking with Kendricks in my lineup. And this is actually a good time to bring this up. Ross, we've gotten some nice feedback on your matchups in our sort of split shows here where we're doing our shows in different times in different places. So why don't you give the folks your matchups for Week 8 here?
Sounds good. Well, I'll start with the bad news. The Bills aren't playing at home, so we don't have that one.
But they're playing in New York, and that's the best tackle venue.
It is, especially for assisted tackles. I mean, I was doing some stats, and I noticed that DeJuan Landry has 7 assisted tackles in 2 games, both at home this year. So, yeah, crazy venue. But the Bills still, regardless, and although they're not at home, it is one of the best matchups, and they are playing the Jets this week. So Mohamed Wilkerson and Sheldon Richardson, who are currently ranked 7th and 8th in PFF IDP scoring, are going to be great matchups this week. I mean, Wilkerson's been pretty phenomenal, 4 sacks, 7 tackles for loss. Richardson not quite as hot, higher tackle floor though, with his 3 sacks and 4 tackles for loss. Both of them are DL1s in my book this week. Another great matchup, the Vikings again. The Bills played the Vikings last week, and we saw plenty of points from Everson Griffin and Jerry Hughes. Well, this week, Michael Johnson and William Goldson from the Bucs are going to get that matchup. The one thing to be a little bit wary about, though, is Michael Johnson's only got 2 solo tackles over the last 2 weeks, so he has had some duck eggs as well. So I want to say he's a great matchup, but a part of me is a little bit wary, so I think I'll probably keep him just outside my DL1 tier. And the Packers have also been a great matchup. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers, despite being the beast, he gets sacked plenty of times. And that means Cameron Jordan and the Saints. Cameron Jordan is a player I keep on banging the drum for in my waiver wire article. I say, I'm just waiting, it's going to happen. Kind of like Robert Quinn. He's already got his 1 sack. He's also got 3 hits and 15 hurries, which totals up at an 8.33% disruption of the quarterback on his pass rushing snaps. That's not great, but Cameron Jordan is a very, very talented player, and I'm just kind of waiting for him to break out. So I'm going to probably be a little bit bullish on him this week and get him nice and high in my rankings. Not sure if he's going to crack the top 5, but probably the top 8. And then if you're looking for something a little bit deeper, the Colts have been a good matchup. And that means if you're looking for a high tackle floor player, Cameron Hayward of the Steelers should be a great matchup this week.
Yeah, and you also want to make sure you get Gerald McCoy in there. I think McCoy might be the one who benefits the most from that matchup against the Vikings. He kind of gets the spot that we saw Griffin in last week, because Griffin's going to kick to defensive tackle a lot. So, plenty of opportunities there. And certainly agree there's just going to be tons of tackles to go around in that Buffalo and New York Jets game. Do you have other positions?
I do. A linebacker, of course. Linebacker is where the money is to be made in IDP fantasy football. And the first matchup I want to concentrate is the Jags against the Dolphins. Now, I was exceptionally bullish last week on Jelani Jenkins and Koa Misi. They did not reward me with many fantasy points, unfortunately. I even started Misi in several leagues. I was that confident. I believe in them again this week. I don't know if I'll quite get Jenkins into my LB1 tier, although obviously the barrage of injuries means he could well be. And I know I'm a lot higher than you on Misi, Jeff. I'll be interested to hear your take on him once I want to finish rambling about all these great matchups. Another good one is the Rams versus the Chiefs. You'll notice that they pop up a few times in the matchup section. So Justin Houston and Josh Moauga, they should have a good matchup. Justin Houston's quietly racked up 7 sacks this season, and Austin Davis can be reached. So perhaps if you're in a big play league, Justin Houston's going to be a good play for you this week. Again, we're going to go to the Colts and Steelers game. We've already touched on perhaps Ryan Shazier is going to be back on the field, although we did say that he may not be an every down linebacker, which kind of dents his value. If you're in a deep league and you're sort of talking about 16 teams, you start 3 or 4 linebackers, I could envisage you putting him in. But Lawrence Timmons, he's really kind of turned the corner again this year. His tackle frequency, when I last looked, was up about 15%. He's ranking as a solid LB1 for me this week. I think he might be the guy that just breaks into the top 5 out of the kind of the lower tier that are stepping up. Another game to look at, the Saints versus the Packers. Now, we've talked about how the Packers linebackers have been revolving, and we've seen Brad Jones in and then out and then Jari Lattimore. All of that's pretty irrelevant. The guy you want to know is AJ Hawk. He's the every down guy. If you're going to play someone, it's going to be him. Of course, in big play leagues, Clay Matthews is of interest. And then let's get back to the other side of the Steelers-Colts game, because the Steelers have also been a great matchup for linebackers, and we've got 2 very solid LB2s in DeQuell Jackson and Jarrell Freeman there. So I think those guys are probably going to creep up from having a bad matchup last week and sort of falling down towards LB3 territory. These guys will probably be banged towards the top of LB2 this week.
Yeah, and the thought on Misi is that he's not an every down guy. He's really only been playing 2 down now, so it's just hard to sustain the tackle production there. Although in the right matchup, he's certainly going to put up numbers. What I also will say is that the Jaguars matchup is very skewed. The matchup data is extremely skewed because of Ryan Kerrigan. Okay, go back and look at what Ryan Kerrigan did. It's a whole bunch of sacks against the Jags, and so the tackle data actually says they're not a very good matchup. Though this could change with the next coming of Barry Sanders and Denard Robinson. At least you would think, the way that everybody's reacting this week. I don't know if that was the product of him really breaking out, or if it was the product of the Browns really playing bad against the run. I'm going to possibly err towards the latter. Also, one other that I want to mention is Preston Brown and Nigel Bradham versus the Jets. I do think you play both of these guys. I think you give the edge to Preston Brown. Preston Brown was the every down guy. Bradham was out there in sub packages, but when they went to dime, he came off the field. So you give the edge to Brown. Tackle-friendly venue, a Jets team that surprisingly is committed to the run. There's going to be some opportunities here for these guys, and their stats will be padded a little bit by that stats crew. All right, the defensive back position.
Indeed. I mean, I think we should just mention that the Giants, who are on a bye this week, are actually a great matchup in every position right now. So it's quite disappointing that I couldn't just list off a load of players playing against the Giants. But that being said, we're going to return to the Rams-Chiefs matchup. The name to be aware of is obviously Eric Berry. Now, is he going to be back on the field? And if he is, can he put up DB1 numbers in his return? If not, I still like Hussein Abdullah as a sneaky DB3 play. He's very underrated. Obviously, he made the headlines mainly for his praying celebration, but that doesn't stop him being a useful fantasy player. So he's someone I would consider starting if you're struggling at defensive back. Another player, it's the second week in a row when Barry Church, the downgraded Barry Church, gets mentioned as a positive matchup. Now, I did say last week he had to put points up or I was going to get him out of my DB1 tier. He put up 14 points. What can I say? That's a good performance. So he's going to stay where he is. I think I've got him ranked number 8 at the minute. I'll probably keep him around number 6, 7, 8, around that kind of, he's a mid-tier DB1 for the time being, especially with a good matchup against the Redskins. The other side of that matchup is also great because Tony Romo has been known to throw an interception or two in his time, although obviously the Cowboys have been great recently. That means Ryan Clark and Brandon Merriweather. Now, the preference is definitely for Clark. Merriweather's a guy who, I don't know. I mean, I just don't think he's going to be any better than a DB3. He has got some upside, but Clark's the guy you want. He's going to be the guy in the box making the hits. We have talked already about a couple of the Packers safeties, Morgan Burnett and Clinton Ha-Ha-Dix. They've got a great matchup against the Saints, so I'll just throw that out there. You should be considering them strongly. Obviously, Ha-Ha is probably the primary option as long as Burnett is out. But if Burnett does play and he's going to get on the field, he could well be the number 1 defensive back this week. And then the final matchup, again, we're going to talk about the Bills and the Jets. Now, we've already alluded to how great a tackle matchup that is. So DeJuan Landry, currently the number 8 ranked defensive back in the PFF scoring system, has 59 total tackles. Like I said, 2 home games with 7 assisted tackles alone. So it's perfectly capable that he could put up a double-digit performance. Keep a sneaky eye on Calvin Pryor, assuming you're in a deeper league, because although he's not on the field every down, this is a guy we're kind of waiting for. He hasn't delivered what we expected. Hopefully this will be the week he can turn it around for your team.
Yeah, and absolutely you're going to want to get Rashad Johnson in your lineups this week against the Eagles. Eagles giving up lots and lots and lots of points to those defensive backs. It's tough to go elsewhere in Arizona, though. I think if you're going to go anywhere else, you would probably err towards Tyrann Mathieu. I know last week didn't work out very well if you happen to try and roll him out there, but I think we'll see a lot of sub-package defense out of the Cardinals in this one, which means lots of opportunities for Mathieu to be on the field. And one other name I'm going to toss out there, this isn't necessarily a matchup play, but more of a circumstance play, is Jonathan Cyprien. You're starting him anyway, but you mentioned the possibility of Morgan Burnett being the number 1. I wouldn't be surprised if Cyprien is the number 1 defensive back this week and just goes out and loads up on like 13 or 14 tackles just because there's nobody else there. Without Posluszny there, Posluszny's a vacuum cleaner on the field, and Geno Hayes is not. So there's going to be more tackle opportunities to go around. So Cyprien gets a boost, and now I have him as an elite level player the rest of the season. All right, let's quickly roll through some players here at each of the positions who you want to avoid this week.
Okay, now let's start with some defensive ends. And after telling everyone to start Cliff Averill for 2 weeks, do not start Cliff Averill. I hate you, Cliff Averill. You are ruining my rankings, my Fantasy Pro rankings, and just taking a dive at defensive end. I've had you in the top 20 for the last 2 weeks, expecting performances, and you've done zip. Well, this week you have the toughest matchup for defensive ends against the Carolina Panthers. So you are definitely being dropped well out of the rank. I wouldn't recommend starting him in any format. And Michael Bennett is also going to get a downgrade. Another tough matchup, it's annoying really, is Carlos Dunlap against the Ravens. Now, Dunlap has been a very good fantasy option this year, quite consistent, currently ranked as a DL1. And his partner in crime, Wallace Gilbey. Now, there has been plenty of rotation opposite Dunlap, but Gilbey's the other guy you're probably going to want to own in Cincinnati. But again, this is a downgrade for both of them. I'm also going to touch on Halogi Nata, the other side of that matchup. Now, the Bengals are an awful matchup across every position. I know you're probably not going to be starting Nata, but if you're in a deeper league, and like we said, there has been issues at defensive end this year, you could be struggling. Maybe you're the guy that dropped to Robert Quinn. Hopefully not if you listen to this show. Don't overreact to things. You picked up someone who's had a good week. Now, Nata hasn't particularly had any good weeks. He's had no sacks, no tackles for loss, and in a tough matchup, I can't see him having a big game. And one final matchup I'm not too keen on is the Packers against the Saints. So the other side of the matchup where we expect Cameron Jordan to go off, I do not expect anything big from Mike Daniels. Over the last few weeks, he's scored 0, 10, 1.5, and 0. It'd be sad to see a player we've both kind of got a liking to, but not saying he's an excellent player, but he's someone we kind of hope would step up this year. 3 zeros in 5 games would be a bad show, and that might well happen.
I'd also maybe lean against Ziggy Ansah this week, believe it or not. Limited in practice with the toe, probable to play, so he's going to play, but it's a tough matchup. Atlanta is actually a lot more difficult than you might realize, yielding the second least fantasy points per game to defensive ends, so you might want to look elsewhere. What about linebackers, Ross?
The first one I've got down, Jeff, is the Titans against the Texans, which means Brian Cushing. But obviously Cushing is reportedly injured. I saw we both had him out of his rankings, but had you slid him back in? Have you heard something different on Cushing?
I don't have him back in.
Maybe it was an old one. But yeah, so obviously avoid your Texans linebackers, especially if Cushing out. If you were thinking about picking up his replacement, I would not recommend it. Again, I know earlier in the show I talked about some linebackers like Durant and McLean who have been doing great things and you should be getting them into your lineup. This is a poor matchup against the Redskins, as Jeff hinted at earlier when we touched on Burfict and maybe players I would potentially use above him. Durant might be a fade in that case. You might have to plug in Burfict just because of his upside. I said the Bengals are a bad matchup for everyone, and that's a real shame if you're a CJ Mosley owner because he's been performing lights out. If you sort of committed early to this trend of, rookie linebackers turning it on in their first few seasons, you're loving what you've got. But this is not the week to over rely on him. And Darryl Smith is partner in crime. He's also an LB1 in today's format of so many injuries. Again, this is a tough matchup, so perhaps downgrade them into the LB2 range. Larry Foote of the Cardinals against the Eagles. He's a guy he started hot and we kind of recommended, but he's definitely slowed down. And when you're not on a hot streak and you're against a tough matchup, he's someone you again definitely want to fade from your lineup. I don't think I'd recommend him as a start in any format this week. And then another difficult one, the Raiders against the Browns. Now, this is difficult for both defensive ends and linebackers, so I've kind of all piled it into one here because obviously their pass rusher comes from their outside linebackers, so be careful if you are thinking about starting, Jabal Sheard or Barcavius Mingo for some crazy reason in a big play scoring system. I would highly recommend you don't. And also be a little bit wary of Carlos Dansby. Now, he has been absolutely excellent this season, 9 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, but this Raiders team has not given up many points to linebackers, so be a little bit careful.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to slide that right into the defensive back because I would say you're sitting Dante Whitner and Tashawn Gibson in this one as well. They got a bad matchup last week. They get a bad matchup here. You're going to want to shy away from them. One other player that I'm going to toss out there is Michael Griffin. I'm just not a big fan of this particular matchup against a Houston team that hasn't given up more than 6 tackles to a defensive back since week 2. So I'll toss those out there, and then I'll let you finish it off here, Ross.
Yeah, I had down the Texans and the Titans as a matchup to avoid. I do think it's worth stating, Jeff, that it's definitely a Griffin over Wilson option if you have to play one. I know we really picked up. Well, I particularly fancied Wilson. I picked him up on plenty of waiver wires. He hasn't delivered the goods. It's been Griffin, who you identified, Jeff, who's the leader in that situation. But yes, this is definitely a matchup. If you're picking these guys up off the waiver wire, you should have starters that you could play instead of them. So definitely keep these guys both off your starting roster. Another deeper one, if you were thinking about playing Mike Adams, because the Colts have the best matchup against the Steelers for defensive backs, they're the worst matchup against the defensive backs. Be wary. He only had 4 total tackles in the last 2 weeks, so he's someone who's not playing well and has got a terrible matchup. A guy who we both like, Jeff, TJ McDonald, he had a bad matchup last week, which we highlighted, and the result was 3.5 points. He's got another bad matchup this week against the Chiefs, and Alex Smith is noodle arm. If you are a fan of Panthers defensive backs, which seems a strange thing to be, Roman Harper, Thomas Deku, just no. That's all. You should already know, but definitely no against the Seahawks. And then the final matchup for me, Jeff, that is disappointing more than anything is Matt Elam. Only 3 total tackles. He's only been over 3 total tackles, in one game this season. That is poor for a guy who we were expecting to take a step up. Again, the Bengals have been an awful matchup, so don't expect Elam to turn it around this week.
Just say no to Matt Elam. Matt Elam out of an every down role. Will Hill's coming, folks. It's only a matter of time before he takes over. They really like him. He was in there, 24 snaps last week. Matt Elam played 24 snaps last week, so it's coming, folks. Keep Will Hill on your radar. Don't pick him up just yet, but and especially you want to avoid this matchup this week. Ross, fantastic stuff. Hopefully this helps everybody out in Week 8, leading you to victories, getting you on your way to the fantasy playoffs. We'll be here with you every step of the way. So for Pro Football Focus Fantasy, he is Ross Miles. I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and that's a wrap.